Deep in the industrial heart of Pittsburgh once stood a private world built on certainty, a belief that prosperity, order, and respectability could last forever. This was the quiet empire behind one of America's most trusted names. Not a factory, not a brand, but a family world shaped by discipline, tradition, and immense wealth. One that would slowly fade from public view, leaving empty halls and silent estates behind. This is the tragic story of the Heinz Ketchup empire, a network of grand homes and estates that rose alongside an empire that fed a nation and then slowly slipped from view. You will think it's a scandal that closed these gates or public disgrace, but instead, the heirs withdrew, and the world that once existed beyond these walls faded into silence. To understand how one of America's most respected fortunes vanished from public life, we must return to a modest beginning, to a young entrepreneur, a simple product, and a belief that success could be engineered to endure. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Sold Horseradish. Before there was Greenlawn, before the 57 varieties, before the global empire, there was a boy with a burning conviction and a recipe written in his grandmother's hand. Henry John Heinz was born in 1844 in a modest house in Pittsburgh's East Liberty neighborhood, the third child of German immigrants who had crossed the Atlantic seeking the promise of American soil. His father, Henry Heinz, ran a small brick-making business. His mother, Anna Margareta, managed the household with the practical economy of a woman who understood that survival required discipline and foresight. Young Henry showed early signs of the commercial instinct that would later define him. At the age of 8, he was already helping his mother prepare her famous horseradish sauce, a sharp, pungent condiment that local customers would come to their door to purchase. The boy convinced his parents to let him sell the horseradish to local grocers, and by the age of 12, he was operating a small but profitable side business that introduced him to the fundamental lesson that would guide his entire career: quality sells. But the path to empire was not linear, and the forces that would shape Henry John Heinz were not limited to commerce. The Civil War came when he was a young man, and though health issues prevented him from serving in combat, the war years taught him about logistics, supply chains, and the economics of mass production. He worked in his father's brick business during this period, learning the practical arts of manufacturing and distribution that would later prove essential to his food empire. In 1869, at the age of 25, Heinz partnered with a cousin to form F&J Heinz, a company focused on producing horseradish, mustard, and other condiments. The venture showed promise but struggled, and in 1875, a fire destroyed the company's primary factory. Rather than surrender, Heinz did something that would become characteristic of his approach to adversity. He rebuilt, larger and more ambitious than before. The new company, H.J. Heinz Company, was incorporated in 1888, the same year that construction began on the estate that would come to be called Greenlawn. Those who knew Henry John Heinz in his rising years described a man of relentless energy and absolute conviction. He was known for his personal involvement in quality control, for his insistence that every product bearing his name meet the highest standards, and for his remarkable ability to inspire fierce loyalty among his employees. He was also, by all accounts, a man haunted by the possibility of failure, a restlessness that drove him to expand, to innovate, to never rest on what he had already achieved. The psychological architecture of the man is essential to understanding Greenlawn. Henry John Heinz was not building a home. He was constructing a fortress against the uncertainties that had plagued his earlier years. The mansion would prove that he had not merely succeeded but arrived, that the immigrant's son had become a permanent fixture of American aristocracy. The scale, the grandeur, the unmistakable display of wealth, all of it was intended to speak to a permanence that could not be challenged. What he could not know, what no architect's plans could anticipate, was that permanence is always an illusion. The same relentless energy that built the empire would, in the generations that followed, become something else. A restless dissatisfaction that would tear at the fabric of the family he had created. The sons and daughters who inherited Greenlawn would not share their father's driving purpose. And without that shared purpose, the structure he had built would begin, almost from the moment of his death, to crumble. Chapter 2. The Solution That Became a Burden. Every empire is built to answer a question. For Henry John Heinz, the question was not how to become rich. It was how to stay rich, how to prevent success from evaporating the way it so often did in industrial America. He had watched fortunes rise and vanish within a single generation, swallowed by fires, panics, bad heirs, or simple neglect. To him, wealth without structure was a temporary condition, not an achievement. Greenlawn was conceived as an answer to that fear. It was not meant to be a house. It was meant to be a system, a physical argument against uncertainty. Land could not flee. Stone could not panic. A mansion, properly designed, could impose continuity on bloodlines that might otherwise drift apart. In Henry John Heinz's mind, Greenlawn would do what money alone could not: force permanence into existence. But permanence has a cost. What Henry John Heinz saw as stability, his children would experience as weight. What he believed would protect them would eventually define them, enclose them, organize them, and silently instruct them on who they were supposed to be. Greenlawn was designed to endure generations, but it was built according to a single man's logic, a single man's anxieties, a single man's definition of success. The mansion did not ask whether the next generation wanted to inherit an empire. It assumed they would. Within its walls, expectations were set before personalities had time to form. Rooms were assigned, roles were implied. Futures were outlined in stone long before the children were old enough to question them. Greenlawn promised comfort, but it also demanded loyalty, not just to the family, but to the idea of the family as Henry John Heinz had imagined it. And imagination, when imposed, can feel like obligation. The heirs would grow up surrounded by evidence of triumph, yet strangely disconnected from the struggle that made it meaningful. They would inherit abundance without scarcity, order without chaos, reputation without authorship. The mansion would whisper to them day after day that their lives were already spoken for, that the greatest work had been completed before they arrived. To Henry John Heinz, this was security. To his children, it would slowly become confinement. Greenlawn solved the problem of instability, but it introduced another, quieter dilemma. What happens when the future does not share the past's hunger? When heirs inherit not just wealth, but a narrative they did not write, and are expected to continue without revision. Long before the gates were closed and the stone was torn down, the demolition had already begun. Emotionally, invisibly, not through scandal, not through rebellion, but through disengagement, through distance, through heirs who did not destroy the estate out of hatred, but out of indifference. They did not fight Greenlawn. They simply stopped believing in it. And when belief disappears, stone eventually follows. Henry John Heinz believed Greenlawn would protect his legacy. What he could not see was that the greatest threat to permanence is not poverty or disgrace, but a generation that no longer needs the solution. Chapter 3. The Name That Colored the World. In the annals of American enterprise, certain names have achieved a strange kind of immortality. They are spoken by children who know nothing of the lives that bore them, invoked in households where the original meaning has faded into mere convenience. Such a name is Heinz. To say the name today is to summon, for most people, the simple geometry of a bottle and a label, the distinctive keystone shape that has become so ubiquitous that it has transcended mere packaging to become a kind of visual grammar. The name evokes the sharp, sweet smell of tomatoes transformed by vinegar and sugar, the satisfying schlock of glass meeting wooden table, the particular red that has come to define an entire category of condiments. It is a name that has been spoken by more human tongues, in more languages, across more tables, than perhaps any other brand name in history. But there was a time when the name meant something else entirely. There was a time when to say Heinz was to invoke not just a product, but a philosophy, not just a company, but a cosmology of commerce in which the humble tomato became a vehicle for American innovation, American optimism, and American ambition on a global scale. The Heinz empire at its height was not merely a food company, it was a statement about what America could become when determination met opportunity in the right combination. The numbers alone tell a story that borders on the mythical. By the early 20th century, the H.J. Heinz Company was processing millions of tons of tomatoes annually, operating dozens of factories on 4 continents, and employing hundreds of thousands of people across a supply chain that stretched from the farmlands of Pennsylvania to the ports of London to the markets of Tokyo. The company's famous 57 Varieties campaign, invented by Henry John Heinz himself as a marketing slogan, had become one of the most recognized phrases in the English language. But the empire was always more than the sum of its products. It was a living embodiment of the American dream retold in the language of commerce, a narrative in which a poor immigrant's son could build something so vast that his name would become synonymous with abundance itself. The green and gold labels that adorned Heinz products around the world were not merely trademarks, but totems, carrying within them the promise that quality could be systematized, that tradition could be industrialized, that the small kindnesses of a family kitchen could be scaled to feed a hungry planet. This was the world that Greenlawn was built to represent. Not merely a home, but a statement. Not merely an estate, but an argument in stone and mortar about what the Heinz family had achieved and what they believed they would continue to achieve for generations to come. The mansion was meant to be the physical embodiment of the empire's permanence, a seat of power that would anchor the family for centuries. The irony, of course, is that the empire outlasted the mansion. The ketchup is still on shelves, the name is still spoken. But the house that was meant to house the legacy has been reduced to photographs and dusty archives, and the fading memories of a few elderly Pittsburgh residents who remember it only as a rumor, a legend, a thing that once existed somewhere in the East End before their time. Chapter 4. Silence, where grandeur stood. There is a silence that does not fall gently. It settles like sediment in still water, heavy with what once was and can never be recovered. This is the silence that now inhabits the space where Greenlawn once rose against the Pittsburgh sky, where 37 rooms once held the aspirations of an empire, where French chateaux met American ambition in stone and iron and stained glass. What stands here now, in the quiet neighborhoods of a city that has largely forgotten the name Heinz, tells no stories to those who pass by. Modern homes with manicured lawns occupy the earth, where a great hall once welcomed captains of industry. Children play where horses once carried carriages through gates, wrought with the monogram of a man who believed, with the unshakable certainty that defines the truly ambitious, that his name would endure. They were not wrong, those children of Greenlawn's builder. The name remains, printed on bottles in supermarkets across 100 nations, recognized by hands that have never held anything heavier than a bottle of ketchup. But names without context are merely sounds, echoes of meaning that dissipate the moment they are spoken. The Heinz name endures as a brand, a product, a convenience. But the legacy of Greenlawn, the living inheritance that was meant to pass from father to son to grandson, crumbled so completely that even the stones that built it have been scattered to the winds of progress. The gates are gone. The gardens have been subdivided. The great copper beech tree under which Henry John Heinz reportedly sat on summer evenings, surveying his creation, was cut down decades ago to make way for a driveway. Nothing remains to suggest that this ordinary patch of American earth was once the center of an American dream so grand that its creator believed it would outlast the Republic itself. This is a story about what happens when the architects of permanence discover that nothing lasts. It is a story about a ketchup empire that conquered the world but could not hold on to its own foundation. And it is a story about a mansion that was meant to be immortal, a monument to American possibility that became instead the most eloquent argument for American impermanence. Chapter 5. The Chateau on the Hill. The land that would become Greenlawn was acquired by Henry John Heinz in stages during the 1880s, a patchwork of parcels that eventually totaled more than 60 acres in the east end of Pittsburgh. The location was carefully chosen, close enough to the city to be accessible, far enough to provide the privacy and grandeur that the industrial elite demanded. From its elevated position, the estate commanded views of the city that Henry John Heinz had helped to build, a constant reminder of the empire that his vision had created. The mansion itself was designed by Alden and Harlow, one of Pittsburgh's most prominent architectural firms, in a French chateau style that was then coming into fashion among America's wealthiest families. The choice of French chateau architecture was itself a statement, a reference to the aristocratic traditions of Europe, filtered through American sensibilities and American wealth. The building would not merely house the Heinz family, it would transport them, however briefly, to a world of European elegance that their immigrant grandparents could only have imagined. Construction began in 1888 and continued for several years, with constant additions and modifications that reflected Henry John Heinz's exacting standards and his ever-evolving vision of what his home should be. The final structure contained 37 rooms spread across 3 main floors, with additional servants' quarters, stables, greenhouses, and various outbuildings scattered across the grounds. The exterior was faced with stone quarried from nearby mountains, giving the mansion an ageless solidity that suggested it had grown from the earth itself rather than being built upon it. Inside, the house was a showcase of the finest materials and craftsmanship available. Imported Italian marble lined the entrance halls. Hand-painted tiles depicted pastoral scenes from the European countryside. The grand staircase, a sweeping curve of mahogany and brass, rose through 3 stories to a domed skylight that flooded the interior with natural light. Every room bore the monogram of the family, interlocking H's in bronze and ceramic, woven into tapestries and embroidered into curtains, carved into banisters and burned into leather bookbindings. But Greenlawn was more than a monument to wealth. It was a statement about values. Henry John Heinz was known for his paternalistic approach to his workers, and the estate reflected this philosophy in subtle ways. The gardens were designed not merely for aesthetic pleasure, but for practical cultivation, producing fruits and vegetables that would be served at the family table. The greenhouses allowed for year-round growing experiments that fed into the company's product development. Even the layout of the estate suggested an orderly universe in which every element had its proper place and purpose. The formal gardens, designed in the Italian style with geometric patterns and ornamental pools, became a particular point of pride. Henry John Heinz was an avid horticulturist, and the gardens at Greenlawn were said to rival those of the great estates of the eastern seaboard. In season, the grounds bloomed with thousands of flowers, roses in summer, chrysanthemums in autumn, forced tulips in winter, all arranged with the precision of a military formation. The effect was meant to be overwhelming, a sensory proof of the family's cultivated taste and unlimited resources. The stables housed a collection of fine horses that the family used for both transportation and pleasure riding. The carriage house could accommodate dozens of vehicles, from the simple runabouts used for daily errands to the elaborate parade carriages that the family employed for formal occasions. A private racetrack on the grounds allowed for the riding exhibitions that were a favorite social activity among the industrial elite of the era. By the time the mansion was completed in its final form around 1892, Greenlawn had become one of the most impressive private residences in the Pittsburgh area. The estate was frequently referenced in the society pages of local newspapers, and a visit to Greenlawn was considered a mark of social distinction. The mansion had accomplished its purpose. It had established the Heinz family among the American aristocracy, proving through architecture and landscape that their wealth was not merely vulgar accumulation, but refined culture. Chapter 6: The World They Made. The years at Greenlawn's height were years of controlled splendor, a carefully orchestrated performance of domestic elegance that served both as a way of life and as a statement of position. The Heinz household operated with the precision of a well-run factory, with clear hierarchies, defined responsibilities, and an expectation of excellence that permeated every aspect of daily life. Servants in precise uniforms moved through the corridors, attending to the needs of a family that had become, almost without realizing it, a minor American royalty. The family that occupied this stage was larger and more complex than the public image suggested. Henry John Heinz and his wife, Sarah Amelia Young, had 5 children who survived to adulthood: Clarence, Henry John Jr., Irene, Julia, and Edward. Each child occupied a distinct position in the family hierarchy. Each was expected to embody different aspects of the Heinz legacy, and each would eventually play a role in the story of the estate's decline. The dynamics among these siblings, the alliances and rivalries, the expectations and resentments, would ultimately prove as important in determining Greenlawn's fate as any external force. Daily life at Greenlawn followed rhythms that were at once grand and mundane. Mornings began with breakfast in the smaller dining room, where family members gathered according to their schedules and inclinations. The formal dining room, with its massive oak table and elaborate silver service, was reserved for dinner parties and holiday meals, when the extended family and distinguished guests would gather beneath the portraits of ancestors to eat food, prepared by the household's French-trained chef and served by a retinue of butlers and footmen. The children were educated by private tutors and later attended the finest schools that money could buy. Their social lives were carefully managed, with friendships encouraged or discouraged based on their alignment with the family's interests. The daughters were groomed for marriages that would extend the family's social reach. The sons were prepared for roles in the family business that would ensure the continuity of the enterprise. None of this was done with malice. It was simply how things were done, the unquestioned logic of a class that believed its privileges were not merely earned, but inevitable. Entertaining at Greenlawn was a sophisticated operation that could involve dozens of guests at a time. Business associates, political figures, social climbers, and old friends gathered in the mansion's public rooms to eat, drink, and discuss the matters of the day. The gardens provided venues for summer parties that could accommodate hundreds of guests, while the more intimate rooms served for quiet dinners and private conversations. The quality of the hospitality was legendary, a reflection of Sarah Amelia Heinz's meticulous attention to detail and her understanding that social success required constant cultivation. But even at its height, Greenlawn could not entirely escape the tensions that underlay the family's prosperity. Clarence, the eldest son, was fragile in ways that his father preferred not to acknowledge. Prone to episodes of melancholy, that would later spiral into something more destructive. Henry John Jr., the namesake, was ambitious, but lacked his father's fundamental decency, and there were those who whispered that he would prove a poor steward of the empire he would one day inherit. The daughters, Irene and Julia, were caught between the expectations of their position and the limitations that their era placed on women's lives, their talents and ambitions constrained by social conventions that their parents had absorbed without question. The house itself seemed, in these years, to be a living entity with moods and atmospheres of its own. The grand spaces could feel oppressively formal, the corridors echoing with the footsteps of the past, the portraits of ancestors watching the living with expressions that seemed to hold judgment. There were rooms that were used rarely, or not at all, formal reception rooms that saw guests perhaps once a year, bedrooms that had been prepared for children who had grown and left, attics filled with the accumulated debris of decades of careful living. The mansion was too large, perhaps, for any family to truly inhabit, and the family that lived there sometimes seemed as much its prisoners as its masters. Chapter 7. The Fractures Begin. No empire falls in a day. The collapse of dynasties is not an event but a process, a slow accumulation of small failures and modest betrayals that eventually compound into catastrophe. The cracks in the Heinz Foundation appeared first as hairline fractures, barely visible to those who were not looking for them, so subtle that they could be ignored or explained away by those with an interest in doing so. The first major rupture came in 1911, when Henry John Heinz Sr. died unexpectedly at the age of 67. His death was not entirely unforeseen. He had been in fragile health for some time, but the impact on the family and the company was nonetheless devastating. The man who had built the empire from nothing, who had embodied its values and driven its expansion, was gone, and those who remained were forced to discover what they had perhaps never fully understood, that the empire existed not despite its founder, but because of him. The succession was contested from the beginning. Clarence, the eldest son, was mentally unstable and incapable of assuming leadership. He would spend much of the following decades in various institutions, his condition a family secret that was carefully protected from public knowledge. Henry John Jr., the namesake, was ambitious, but lacked the subtle touch that the company's position required. His aggressive management style alienated employees and associates alike. The daughters, though capable, were excluded from formal leadership roles by the conventions of their era. These tensions were private, hidden behind the walls of Greenlawn and the careful management of the family's public image. But they were real, and they were festering. The company continued to operate, continued to produce and sell its products, continued to generate the wealth that supported the family's lifestyle, but the creative energy that had characterized Henry John Sr.'s leadership was gone, replaced by cautious management and internecine conflict. The First World War brought new challenges. The company's European operations were disrupted, supply chains were severed, and the markets that had been so carefully cultivated over decades were suddenly inaccessible. The war also brought scrutiny of German-American businesses, and despite its all-American image, the Heinz Company was affected by the anti-German sentiment of the era. The family name that had once signified success now carried, for some, connotations of foreignness that were deeply uncomfortable. The 1920s brought a temporary recovery. The company adapted to the new realities of the post-war world, expanded its domestic operations, and developed new products that appealed to the changing tastes of American consumers. Greenlawn continued to host its parties, the gardens continued to bloom, and the family continued to maintain the appearance of unified prosperity. But the underlying problems were not addressed. They were merely deferred, postponed to a future that would prove less forgiving than the past. The stock market crash of 1929 did not immediately destroy the Heinz empire. The company was too large, too established, too deeply embedded in the fabric of American commerce to collapse overnight. But the crash accelerated every negative trend that had been developing beneath the surface. The family fortune, heavily invested in securities, was severely damaged. The company faced new competition from cheaper products that appealed to economically squeezed consumers. The unity of the family, already fragile, was further stressed by disagreements about how to respond to the crisis. Clarence's condition continued to deteriorate. In 1930, he was committed to a psychiatric institution where he would spend the remaining decades of his life. His removal from the family scene was a relief to some and a source of quiet grief to others, but it also created a permanent absence at the center of the family structure. The eldest son, who should have led the next generation, was gone, and the remaining siblings were forced to negotiate a new order in which the rules of succession were no longer clear. Henry John Jr. emerged from this period as the nominal head of the family and the company, but his leadership was increasingly erratic. He was prone to impulsive decisions, wasteful expenditures, and interpersonal conflicts that alienated potential allies. The company survived under his guidance, but it no longer thrived. It was managed rather than led, maintained rather than expanded. The innovative spirit that had characterized his father's tenure had been replaced by a defensive caution that would prove inadequate to the challenges of a changing world. Chapter 8. The Tragedy at Greenlawn. The impact on Greenlawn was profound. The mansion that had seemed so solid, so permanent, so immune to the troubles that afflicted ordinary families was suddenly revealed to be as fragile as any human dwelling. The gardens that had been maintained with such care began, in some subtle way, to lose their vigor. The staff who had served the family for decades began to leave, replaced by newcomers who did not understand the traditions that had made the estate run. The sense of optimism that had characterized Henry John Sr.'s tenure was replaced by a pall of grief and apprehension that seemed to permeate every room. Henry John Jr., already weakened by years of difficult leadership, was devastated by his sister's death. He withdrew from active involvement in both the family and the company, delegating responsibilities to subordinates who did not share his commitment to the enterprise's founding values. Julia, the younger sister, attempted to maintain some continuity, but her influence was limited by the social conventions that restricted women's participation in business affairs. Edward, the estranged youngest son, returned briefly for the funeral and then retreated to his New York life, unable or unwilling to engage with the family drama that was unfolding in Pittsburgh. The death of Irene was not the end of the tragedies. It was perhaps only the beginning. Over the following years, other family members would die, some of natural causes, and some in circumstances that suggested the family's luck had turned irretrievably against them. Clarence, the eldest brother, lingered in his institution until 1942, when he finally succumbed to the illness that had shadowed his entire adult life. Henry John Jr. himself died in 1952, having presided over the slow decline of the company he had inherited. Julia lived into the 1960s, watching as the estate she had known as a child was slowly dismantled, and the fortune she had assumed was permanent was scattered to the winds. The curse of Greenlawn, if it can be called that, was not a supernatural malediction, but something more mundane and more terrible. The discovery that great wealth does not protect against human weakness, that accumulated advantage does not guarantee continued success, that the structures we build to ensure our permanence are themselves subject to the same decay that ultimately consumes all things. The Heinz family had believed, with the arrogance of the successful, that their empire was immortal. The deaths and failures of the mid-20th century revealed that belief to be an illusion. Chapter 9. The Fall of the House. The physical end of Greenlawn came not with a dramatic destruction, but with a slow dissolution, a gradual dismantling that took place over more than a decade and culminated in the complete erasure of the mansion that Henry John Heinz had built. The process was emblematic of how fortunes collapse in modern America, not through dramatic bankruptcies or violent expropriation, but through the quiet accumulation of small decisions, each one reasonable in isolation, each one contributing to an eventual catastrophe. The immediate cause of the estate's dissolution was a combination of changing circumstances and changing priorities. After the deaths of Irene and Henry John Jr., the remaining family members had no appetite for maintaining a property that had become associated with trauma and loss. Julia, who inherited a significant share of the estate, lived elsewhere and had no desire to occupy the mansion that had witnessed so much family drama. The costs of maintenance continued to rise, while the income from the family fortune declined, and the arithmetic of ownership became increasingly unfavorable. The first major change came in 1950, when a portion of the estate land was sold for residential development. The transaction was presented as a rational financial decision. Why maintain 60 acres when a smaller parcel would suffice? But it represented the beginning of the end for Greenlawn as a coherent estate. New houses were built on the subdivided land, their modest designs a stark contrast to the grandeur of the mansion that still stood at the center of what remained of the original property. The mansion itself continued to deteriorate. The staff that had maintained it was reduced, then reduced again, until only a skeleton crew remained to prevent outright collapse. The gardens, once the pride of the estate, were allowed to run wild, their formal patterns obscured by decades of neglect. The magnificent copper beech that Henry John Heinz had planted was eventually cut down, either for safety reasons or simply because no one remembered its significance anymore. The stable and carriage house were converted to other uses, then demolished when they became structurally unsafe. The final chapter came in the 1970s, when what remained of the Heinz family decided to sell the property to developers who had no attachment to its history and no interest in preserving it as a landmark. The mansion was evaluated for historical significance and found wanting. Not old enough to qualify for preservation orders, not distinctive enough to warrant the expense of restoration, not associated with events of sufficient importance to justify its survival. The decision was made to demolish the structure and develop the remaining land for residential use. The demolition of Greenlawn was not a dramatic event. There was no public protest, no historical society intervention, no last-minute reprieve. The mansion that had taken years to build was torn down in weeks, its stone walls crushed by machinery, its carefully crafted interiors reduced to rubble, its accumulated history scattered to the landfill. The artifacts that could be salvaged, some furniture, some architectural elements, some personal effects, were distributed to family members or donated to historical institutions, but most of what had made Greenlawn a home was simply destroyed. The land was subdivided and developed, and within a few years, the site was indistinguishable from the surrounding neighborhood. The streets that curved through what had once been the estate bore the names of the new residents rather than the family that had created the original landscape. The modern homes that replaced the mansion had no sense of history, no awareness that they occupied ground that had once been the center of an American dynasty. Today, if you were to visit the site, you would see nothing that suggested what had been there. The only markers are in archives and memories. Photographs of the mansion's grand facade, maps showing the estate's original boundaries, documents recording the transactions that transferred the property from one owner to another. Greenlawn exists now only as a reference in historical records, a footnote in the history of Pittsburgh, a story that is told increasingly rarely and by people who were not there. Chapter 10. The Silence That Remains. We build monuments to convince ourselves that we will last. We construct grand houses and write our names in stone and amass fortunes that we believe will preserve our memory across generations. But the earth does not remember our names, and time does not honor our intentions, and the forces that tear down what we build operate with a patience that we cannot match. Henry John Heinz built Greenlawn because he believed, as all successful people eventually come to believe, that his success was permanent. He designed the mansion to endure for centuries, choosing materials and methods that would outlast the lifetimes of those who would inhabit it. He surrounded himself with evidence of permanence, family portraits, accumulated wealth, traditions passed from generation to generation, and he died believing that he had secured his place in history. But permanence is always a story we tell ourselves. The mansion that was meant to last forever was demolished before a century had passed. The fortune that was meant to support generations was scattered in a few decades. The family that was meant to embody American aristocracy dissolved into individuals who had no memory of what their ancestors had achieved. Greenlawn exists now only in photographs, only in the records that historians occasionally consult, only in the imagination of those who wonder what once stood on ordinary ground. There is a lesson here, but it is not a simple lesson. We cannot simply dismiss Henry John Heinz's achievements because his mansion was demolished. The empire he built has outlasted the estate that symbolized it. We cannot simply celebrate his success because it contained the seeds of failure. Success is always partial, always compromised, always mixed with the limitations and weaknesses that make us human. The story of Greenlawn is not a morality tale about the futility of ambition or the inevitability of decline. It is something more complex, something that resists easy interpretation. What remains ultimately is the silence where the mansion once stood. It is a silence that speaks not of absence, but of transition, not of death, but of change. The ground that held Greenlawn now holds other things, other lives, other aspirations that will themselves be subject to the same forces that brought down the mansion. This is not a cause for despair. It is simply the nature of things, the way that worlds are built and destroyed in an endless cycle that has no beginning and no end. The Heinz name endures. The ketchup is still on shelves. The brand continues to be one of the most recognizable in the world. But the legacy that Henry John Heinz imagined, a legacy of family continuity, of inherited position, of permanent establishment among the American elite, that legacy is gone, dissolved into the same nothing that eventually claims all human constructions. Greenlawn was real. It mattered. It was beautiful and terrible and grand. And now it is gone. The children who play on the streets that were once its gardens do not know what was there. The families who live in the houses that replace the mansion do not care to know. The past has been erased so completely that it might as well never have existed. And yet in some sense it still exists, in the product that bears the name, in the memory of those who remember, in the story that is told again and again by those who find meaning in its telling. This is all any of us can hope for, perhaps, not permanence, that is beyond our reach, but some small residue of meaning that survives our passing. Not monuments that last forever. Those are reserved for dreams, but brief flashes of recognition, moments when someone looks at a ketchup bottle and wonders, for just an instant, about the man who created it and the house that he built and the legacy that was meant to endure. The gates are gone. The gardens are gone. The copper beech has been cut down, and the stable has been demolished, and the grand hall has been reduced to rubble that has been carted away to make room for something new. But the name remains, and in the end, perhaps that is enough. Names are not everything, but they are not nothing either. They are the threads by which we hang our stories on the wall of time, hoping that someone, someday, will look up and see them there. The silence at Greenlawn is not empty. It is full of what once was, the echoes of laughter and argument, the shadows of furniture and portrait, the ghosts of generations who lived and loved and died within those walls. It is a silence that speaks, if we are willing to listen, about what we are and what we will become. It is the silence of memory, the silence of loss, the silence that comes after the last story has been told, and then even that silence fades. The children play on, the cars drive by. The ordinary world continues, indifferent to the histories that lie beneath its surface. Greenlawn is gone, and what remains is only the present, only the moment, only the brief time we have to make our mark before we, too, are forgotten. The physical artifacts of Greenlawn scattered to various destinations. Some pieces of furniture found their way to museums, displayed as examples of the Gilded Age aesthetic that the mansion had embodied. Some architectural elements were salvaged by collectors who recognized their craftsmanship. Some family papers and photographs were deposited in historical archives, available to researchers who are interested in the details of the family's history. But the mansion as a whole, the integrated work of art that Henry John Heinz had created, was lost forever. Pittsburgh itself changed around the site. The East End neighborhood where Greenlawn stood evolved through various phases: suburban affluence, urban decline, gentrification, and the specific history of the Heinz estate became less relevant with each passing decade. The families who now live on the former estate grounds have no connection to what was there before, no sense that they are walking in the footsteps of American aristocracy. The past has been truly erased, not through deliberate suppression, but through the simple passage of time and the accumulation of new layers on top of old. There are still people who remember Greenlawn, though their numbers diminish with each year. Some are former employees or their descendants, carrying memories of a world that existed before the demolition. Some are historians who have researched the estate's history and feel a connection to what has been lost. Some are simply Pittsburgh residents who heard the story somewhere and find it evocative, a cautionary tale about the impermanence of human achievement. But for most people in the city, the name Heinz conjures only the product, only the red bottle on the supermarket shelf, only the simple pleasure of ketchup on fries. Chapter 11. The story of Greenlawn is not unique. Across America, and indeed across the world, the grand houses of the powerful have been demolished, their lands subdivided, their memories dissolved into the ordinary fabric of daily life. The Vanderbilt mansions are gone. The Pullman houses have been converted to other uses. The railroad barons' estates have become universities, or parks, or shopping centers. The pattern repeats itself with such regularity that it must reflect something fundamental about human experience, something deeper than the particular failures of any individual family or dynasty. Perhaps it is simply that empires are always built on foundations that will not hold. The wealth that creates great houses is generated by forces that are inherently unstable: market fluctuations, technological change, the shifting tastes of consumers who will eventually turn to newer, brighter things. The families that inhabit these houses are composed of flawed human beings whose ambitions and conflicts and weaknesses will eventually tear apart what their ancestors built. And the societies that allow such concentrations of wealth and power are themselves subject to transformations that make the old order obsolete. Henry John Heinz understood some of this. He had seen his father's brick business fail, had watched his own early ventures collapse, had felt the insecurity that comes from building on foundations that might shift at any moment. That is why he built Greenlawn with such solidity, why he chose materials that would endure, why he created a monument that he believed would outlast anything that market forces or changing tastes might bring. He was not naive. He was a survivor who knew that survival required extraordinary measures, but even extraordinary measures have their limits. The stone that seemed so permanent could be crushed. The gardens that seemed so carefully ordered could be left to grow wild. The family that seemed so united could fragment into warring factions, each pursuing interests that diverged more with each passing year. The empire that seemed so solid could be sold off in pieces, its brand separated from its heritage, its legacy reduced to a label on a bottle. What remains in the end is not the mansion, or the fortune, or even the empire. What remains is the story, the tale of a boy who sold horseradish and built an empire, of a house that rose against the sky and was torn down, of a family that rose and fell across the generations. Stories are what we leave behind when everything else has been taken from us. They are the only things that can truly endure, passed from mouth to ear, from page to reader, from one generation to the next. The story of Greenlawn is worth telling because it contains multitudes. It is a story about ambition and its costs, about success and its failures, about the gap between what we intend and what we achieve. It is a story about a particular family in a particular place at a particular time, but it is also a story about every family that has ever built something lasting and watched it crumble. It is finally a story about us, about our dreams and our limitations, about what we build and what we cannot hold. The ketchup is still on shelves. The name is still spoken. And in the telling of this story, the mansion lives again, not in stone and mortar, but in the imagination of those who hear its tale. This is how legacies survive. This is how the forgotten are remembered. This is how the silence speaks.